Namaste, Vanakkam and Namaskaram. I am Kayleen Moodley from the Youth Committee of the South African Hindu Maha Sabha, and I extend a warm welcome to all to this afternoon's COVID-19 Bereavement and Grief Counseling webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in the sudden premature loss of life, which has had a devastating impact on families and communities. Hindu funerals are solemn, dignified and sacred. When performed with respect, dignity and devotion, the final rites help to connect to the deceased and assist loved ones with the bereavement process. Hinduism clarifies that the body is temporary but the soul is permanent. The Sanskrit word dihanta means end of the body. According to the Bhagwad Gita, the soul is neither born nor does it ever die, nor having once existed does it ever cease to be. The soul is without birth, eternal, immortal and ageless. It is not destroyed when the body is destroyed. The continued need for isolation during this pandemic has meant that traditional support systems such as family and friends during the bereavement process was not possible. Many families are struggling with inconsolable loss. Therefore, the South African Hindu Maha Sabha has organized this afternoon's webinar on COVID-19 bereavement and grief counseling. Our first speaker is Dr. Lokesh Maharaj. Dr. Lokesh Maharaj is a senior lecturer in Curriculum and Education Studies in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He has tertiary qualifications in Hindi and Sanskrit and is a practicing Hindu priest. In 2011, he graduated with a PhD entitled The Bhagavad Gita for Values Education in Life Orientation, Perceptions and Possibilities. He is currently one of the lead researchers with academics from the University of Delhi in a project on yoga, religion and education in India and South Africa. Dr. Maharaj is a member of the Executive Committee of the Sri Sanatana Dharma Sabha of South Africa. He also heads the Priest Council of the South African Maha Sabha.
Namaste, Vanakkam, Namaskar. I am honored to be sharing a message with you at this COVID-19 Bereavement and Grief Counseling webinar organized by the South African Hindu Maha Sabha. The reaction to the loss of a loved one is referred to as grief. Bereavement is the process we undergo when separated from a person upon whom we depend for comfort, sustenance, and sanctuary. Grief after the passing of a loved one is normal and an ordinary human experience. Since March 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic hit our shores, we have lost many loved members of our families and community. Due to the strict COVID-19 protocols put in place, many of us have not been able to grieve our dear one's loss. All South Africans, but mostly Hindus, have had to conduct funerals and subsequent ceremonies under very trying conditions. The COVID-19 pandemic robbed many families of joining and supporting each other during funerals. Hindu funerals are solemn, dignified, and sacred. Family and relatives congregate at the deceased's home to mourn the death of a relative and conduct all funerary rituals. Our ancient sages, seers, and ancestors understood the human mind and its functioning. The ceremonies associated with the funeral and the mourning period have remained almost unchanged for centuries. Sri Dhir Chaitanya says that the fact that the ceremonies associated with the funeral and the traditional mourning period have sustained unchanged for thousands of years only highlights the fact that they serve a meaningful process, a purpose. When performed with respect, dignity, and devotion, the final rites help connect to the deceased person and go through the bereavement process. In this regard, Chaitanya again says, for an individual who lives a religious life with an appreciation of the Lord, dealing with the death of an individual he is connected to while being essentially a sad experience also becomes a spiritually uplifting one. In this presentation, I argue that the funeral rituals and ceremonies can heal people's pains upon a close family member's death. I talk about the upon death rituals, especially the offering of pindas as a healing process. I also highlight how the after funeral rituals, such as the 12th day ceremony, help bring closure for the surviving relatives. My presentation proceeds to show how the Bhagavad Gita and other scriptures may serve as important resources in our bereavement process. I conclude with a brief discussion of death from a Hindu perspective. Before I proceed, I want to acknowledge that the coronavirus pandemic has meant that many of us have lacked the necessary support systems when our loved ones have passed on. I'm aware that many of the rituals had to be done technically in the absence of family. I want to talk about funeral and the subsequent ceremonies, and I begin with the upon death rituals. When a death occurs in a Hindu home, arrangements for the final rites begin immediately. Hindu scriptures advise that the body of the deceased should be disposed of immediately. Among the Hindus, preparation of the body for disposal is not left to professionals who are unconnected to the deceased. The family prepares the body for cremation and stays with it until it is cremated. This makes the whole experience of losing a loved one very intimate and intense. Again, the coronavirus prevented many of us from participating in this important spiritual activity, making the bereavement process more challenging. Hinduism clarifies that the body is temporary and the soul is permanent. The Sanskrit word dehanta means the end of the body. Life does not end. The Hindu scriptures remind us that the body is made up of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Cremation, the preferred form of disposing of the body, ensures that the body returns to the five elements. Cremation assists the grieving family in detaching from the physical body of the deceased. Cremation signifies the end of the deceased's physical body. The final detachment with the physical body is symbolized with the immersing of the ashes into flowing water. A PhD student in cognitive science, Ketika Garg, commented on the debase of a relative. Standing at a place where millions before me had come and gone, where my ancestors performed their rites, I let go of my mother's final remains in the holy waters of the river Ganga. Watching them float away with the waves of the ancient river helped me recognize that this was not the end, but a small fragment in the bigger circle of life. The final rites are accompanied by a ritual referred to as Pindadana. This is said to have a therapeutic effect on the surviving family members. Pinda means body. Pindadan means giving charity to the body of the deceased. Pindadan helps the deceased overcome challenges in its journey to Pitraloka and unite with its ancestors. The offering of Pinda helps the soul to cut its ties and attachments with the material human body. The Pindadan helps the soul to move forward in peace. This is the deceased, through smell, accepts the Pindadan. The actual Pinda or food is not physically eaten. The deceased feel the emotions with which the Pindadan is offered. This is why Pindadan is referred to as Shraddha. Shraddha comes from the word Shraddha, which means respect and devotion. Shri Ram offered Pinda to his father Dasharath. Mother Sita also did Pindadan on the Phalgun river banks. There is a belief that no work should be done without the blessing of ancestors. The offering of Pinda brings blessings of the ancestors. It helps to come to terms with the death of a loved one. I move on now to talk about the after-funeral rituals. Many Hindu families observe strict discipline for about 13 days, immediately after an immediate family member's death. Each evening, a special discourse from a scripture, Garud Puran, is conducted at the deceased's home. The recital and discussion of the contents of the Pret Kand are considered extremely meritorious for both the living and the deceased at the onset of death. It brings succor to the relatives and assists in a general understanding of life. It traces our journey from inception through to the afterlife. The contents of this Puran are relevant to the living as it encourages the aspirant to follow a dharmic life that will save it from the torturous journey awaiting the sinner. Fortunately, technology allowed these evening discourses to continue virtually, with families joining from all parts of the country and outside the country. Each morning, for the next 10 days after the funeral, a Pindadan is done at the home of the deceased. For various practical reasons, these Pindas may be offered collectively on the 10th day. The value and significance of the Pindadan have already been explained. One of the main ceremonies performed on the 12th day is Sapindikaran, which means the union of the soul with its ancestors. After this day, the deceased is no longer referred to as Preta. This day brings about a shift in the attitude of the family towards the deceased. They gain a degree of objectivity and distance emotionally from the deceased. And they look up to the deceased with gratitude and offer worship. After the 13th day ritual, many Hindus conduct a monthly prayer based on the moon phase on which a person passed on. However, many Hindus in South Africa conduct a 6th month and a yearly prayer out of convenience. All the ceremonies, from death up to the yearly prayer, are accompanied by charity and donations to the indigent and orphanages. Feeding people in memory of the deceased is considered meritorious. The Antyeshti Sanskar, the final rites, and the subsequent ceremonies up to the 1-year ceremony may serve as a source of strength, reassurance, and comfort. The Antyeshti Sanskar and the ceremonies address both the deceased and the bereaved family. The Hindu shares a special relationship with God and the universe. The ceremonies after death are based on this Vedic relationship between an individual and God. The ceremonies after death are intended to bring closure for the surviving family. The rituals allow the surviving family to undergo intense experiences. The after-funeral rituals give rise to sentiments that we may or may not have known. The physical acts of invoking the deceased, imagining the deceased's presence, relating to the deceased, and interacting with the deceased in making offerings, like the Pindadan mentioned earlier, all help evoke emotions in the bereaved that may be difficult to experience and accept ordinarily. The support the bereaved receive from family and friends who take care of them and share their sorrow makes their sadness easier to bear. The repeated prayers to the Lord during the after-funeral rituals in various forms give the bereaved family strength. Performing acts of atonement for the deceased in the form of giving charity to those in need helps them to overcome to an extent their feelings of helplessness and guilt. After having gone through several days of intense prayer, the bereaved may be ready to and may need to lessen the intensity of their feelings and expressions. By this time, they may have been prepared to accept the reality of their loss for the most part. While the prescribed period is by no means indicative of an end to the grief, it gives the bereaved adequate strength to ease back into their normal daily activities and life. They will eventually come to terms with their loss over time. Ketiki Garg, a PhD student in cognitive science, explains the importance of rituals in the grieving process. And she says, rituals can hold the core beliefs of a culture and provide a sense of control in an otherwise helpless situation. I understood this when I lost my mother last year and participated in the primary Hindu rituals of death and grief. Rituals can help us understand concepts that are otherwise elusive to grasp. For example, scholar Nicole Boivin describes the importance of physical doorways in rituals of social transformation, like marriage in some cultures. The experience of moving through doorways evokes transition and creates an understanding of change. Similarly, Amita Joshi, who experienced 2 deaths in her family in a short space of time, praises the wisdom in the post-funeral ceremonies when she says, nevertheless, 13 days of mourning, the way my elders did it, made me stronger. It is painful, awkward, and startles you. But facing both deaths square in the face helped. Even the funerals were open casket, and I watched as my cousins, not even teenagers yet, bravely holding my grandfather and uncle's hands in their coffins before they were taken away. I learned in time that it felt far more complete to be with them each step of the way than walk away at the hospital and never see their faces again. It felt better to see them dressed up in their finest one last time. My friends thought it was full on, and they were not wrong. But what happened by the time those days were over was that I mourned. I had mourned hard without any complication. It does not take away the pain of a losing person, but it shows you many things, like how it is okay to take time out to try to come to terms with it, rather than launching back into normality like it never happened. Even if your methods keeps you busy, it reminded me that it is okay not to be functioning at the usual speed. The usefulness of the funerary rituals are further explained by Sridhar Chaitanya. He says it was only when I experienced my parents' death and was required to perform all the elaborate religious rituals that I gained an appreciation of the profoundness of Hindu religious rites, traditions, and customs connected to the death of an individual. I want to move on now to say a little bit about what scriptures say as far as death, grief, and bereavement is concerned. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna offers important points on grieving and counseling. He says that the wise grieve for neither the dead nor the living. I realize, however, that this may be hard to understand. Sri Krishna is advising that we should not grieve for that form or body anymore. His reason is explained in the verse, Bahuni me vyatitani janmani tava cha arjuna tanyaham veda sarvani na tvam vyetha parantapa. There was never a time that you and I did not exist. You know them not, I know them all. That is the translation of the verse. So this means that the loved ones we have lost are everlasting. The Bhagavad Gita reminds us that the same person has died earlier and will die again in the future. It teaches further that consciousness is critical. Once we enter consciousness, it will never die. The Bhagavad Gita asserts that those who have passed are perfectly fine. The reason for this is found in the verse, there is no place where my consciousness does not exist. We must all live in the belief that our loved ones are in the safe hands of God. Let us remain loyal to the confidence bestowed upon us by Sri Krishna. Death is the only guarantee after birth. The Bhagavad Gita says, Jatasya hi dhruvor mrityur dhruvam janma mritasya cha tasmada pariharyerthe natvam shochitur marhasi. One who has taken birth is sure to die, and after death, one is sure to take birth again. Hindu sages have declared that what we call death is nothing short of ignorance. The Bhagavad Gita continuously reminds us that life is eternal. Life existed before birth, and it will exist after death. Life also exists between birth and death. The Puranas, too, declare that the soul is eternal, but the body is temporary. The Svetashvatara Upanishad says, if we believe the soul is eternal, then it follows logically that there is life after death of the material body. This verse states that creation is a combination of three entities, God, soul, and Maya. And all the three entities are eternal. Death, according to the Bhagavad Gita, is simply a change of body for the soul. The Atma or soul is eternal. Only the body, made up of the five material elements, that is earth, water, fire, air, and ether, dies, and the elements return to the sources from which they came. The Bhagavad Gita emphasizes the eternal nature of the Atma, which is beyond the reach of material things. The Gita says, Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavakaha, na chainam kledayantyapo, na shoshiyati marutaha. For this Atma cannot be cut by any weapon, nor can it be burnt by fire, nor wet by water, or dried by the wind. Dr. Vasudha Narayanan, professor of religion at the University of Florida and head of the American Academy of Religion, was asked if there is anything in the theory of reincarnation or Hindu philosophy that can give solace to the grieving. Her response was, what gives solace is the notion of immortality of the soul. The soul never dies, and we have discarded this body because the soul is here and always will be. When you read the verses of the Bhagavad Gita in your time of grief, they speak to you. When you read them in a class or at other times, they are very beautiful. But when you read them in a time of pain, they are almost like a revelation, and it's like a soothing hand on you. Death is viewed as a natural aspect of life. Sri Chinmoy writes that death is a resting room. Hindus do not see death as extinction. Sri Chinmoy continues to say, it is a meaningful departure. When our consciousness is divinely transformed, the necessity of death will not arise at all. To transform life, we need peace, light, bliss, and power. We cry for these divine qualities. They cry for our aspirations. They are equally anxious to grant us everlasting life. But until our body, mind, heart, and soul aspire together, the divine power, light, bliss, and peace cannot possess us. A loved one who is deceased is always remembered. There is no such thing as completely getting over or resolving the death of a loved one. There are recurring occasions in one's life when the absence of a loved one is felt with varying degrees of sadness. However, one can experience this feeling without much discomfort and continue to live happily. Swami Dayanand Saraswati, the guru of Sri Dhira Chaitanya, whom I have quoted earlier, contends that it is not time that heals, but that we heal ourselves by resorting to different methods in time. One of these methods is the Hindu religious practices. And Sri Dhira Chaitanya says, even in life, the reality of death is objectively faced in Hindu culture. Death serves as a reminder to the living to use the human body for acts of virtue. The Garud Puran places emphasis on our everyday life. Bhagwan Deva Devesha Sharanagata Vatsalah Asare Ghora Sansare Sarva Dukha Mali Mase Nana Vidha Sharirastha Ananta Jiva Rashaya Jayante Cha Mriyante Cha Tesham Ante Na Vidyate Sada Dukha Tura Eva Na Sukhi Vidyate Kvachit Kenopayen Mokshesha Muchyante Vadame Prabho Chaturshiti Laksheshu Sharireshu Sharirinam Na Manusham Vinayan Yatra Tatvagyanam Tu Labhyate Atra Janma Sahasranam Sahasrer Api Kotibhi Kadachil Labate Jantur Manushyam Punya Sanchayat. And this means that there are 8,400,000 species of life into which one can be born. Only the human birth is suited to achieve liberation. Human birth is achieved through many years of good karma. Therefore, having attained the human birth, one should not waste it by engaging in activities that prevent one from crossing over this ocean of birth and death. Since the human form is the only one that can lead to liberation, one should protect it. One should earn sufficient wealth to ensure that one's body is healthy and that it can be used to engage in dharmic activities. One's liberation from the ocean of birth and death is in one's hands. Nobody else can be responsible for one's liberation. I began this presentation with reference to the use of technology. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed us to rethink how we fulfill the rituals related to death. The rules governing physical contact during the coronavirus have compelled us to use technological platforms to conduct rituals. While this will take some time getting used to, we may have no other option but to embrace the technology, especially if we want to continue our centuries-old spiritually uplifting funeral rituals. Join me as I pray for our dear family and relatives' souls to attain the highest abode. Om Anadinideno Deva Shankachakra Gadadhara Akshaya Pundari Kaksha Pitra Moksha Prado Bhava Atasi Pushpa Sankasham Pitavasa Samachyutam Ye Namasyanti Govindam Na Tesham Vidyate Bhayam Krishna Krishna Kripalastvam Agatinam Gatir Bhava Sansarnava Ghananam Prasiddha Purushoktama Narayana Surasreshta Lakshmi Kanta Varaprada Anena Tarpane Natha Pitra Moksha Prado Bhava Hiranya Garbha Purushaha Vyakta Vyakta Swarupine Asya Pitrasya Mokshartham Suprito Bhava Sarvada. O imperishable lotus-eyed Lord, wielding the conch, discus, and mace, may it please you to grant liberation to the departed one. Those who worship the Lord Govinda of dark hue, garbed in yellow silk, for them there is no fear of death. O most merciful Lord Krishna, who art the savior of the helpless, have mercy upon those who are drowning in this ocean of repeated birth and death. O Lord Narayana, foremost of divinities, consort of Lakshmi, Lord of humankind, please show compassion and grant liberation to the departed one. Namaste, Vanakkam, Namaskar.
Our second speaker this afternoon is Professor Suvira Ramlall. Professor Suvira Ramlall is both an active clinician and academic involved in undergraduate and postgraduate medical education. She is the clinical manager of psychiatric services at a public psychiatric hospital in Durban, academic leader at the Nelson Mandela Medical School at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, president of the College of Psychiatrists in the Colleges of Medicine in South Africa, director of the KZN branch of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting mental well-being at community level. Professor Ramlall's areas of interest include depression, spirituality and psychiatry, cognitive disorders, telepsychiatry, psychotherapy, and medical education. She also serves on the Provincial Mental Health Advisory Committee. She has contributed as an author to the South African Oxford Textbook of Psychiatry and is a co-author and co-editor of the Talk Therapy Toolkit, which is a South African textbook for counselors and psychotherapists.
Our planet is governed by natural and spiritual laws that uphold divine order. Our every human experience on both a personal and a collective level is cosmically orchestrated with scientific precision and divine purpose. We are living through a spiritual watershed moment in our history, and the intense and immense tsunami of pain that has been unleashed is not a death knell for humanity, but a clarion call for both human and spiritual transformation. By seeking truth, we can bring light into our minds and hearts and thereby realize our immortality. Prem Namaste and a loving welcome to all. Our search for guidance and healing through our personal and collective journey through grief is a journey in search of light. Ultimately, it is the choice to travel the higher road. It is a journey initiated in an inquiring human mind, fueled by the love and compassion of the heart, and whose destination is the wisdom residing within the soul. This is a public and rather impersonal platform to engage with you on a very sensitive topic at a time when we are all emotionally vulnerable and our wounds raw. Each of you may be in different stages of acute or prolonged grief, recovery, or healing. If you are recently bereaved, you may not now be ready emotionally or spiritually for this information. Please use your discretion. Grief is a lengthy and painful state requiring much love and patience. Take time to process your acute grief and attempt to move forward and upward once you feel emotionally stronger and inwardly prompted to do so. Let there be no judgment for your own or others' experience or handling of grief. We are all fellow travelers on life's journey, and ultimately we will all heal in our own unique way, at our own pace, in our own time. This presentation is divided into the following sections. A global and unprecedented wave of loss has shrouded the entire planet in grief. Grief is the human response to loss of any nature, the loss of our sense of safety and security, the loss of our health, the loss of our freedom, the loss of jobs, and the loss of our former lifestyles. Compounding these losses, there has been a concomitant, unprecedented loss of life within a relatively short time span, leaving us not just bereaved, but simultaneously without access to the traditional measures that provide support, healthy adjustment, comfort, and healing. This is due to the stringent but necessary lockdown measures that have been imposed. While international travel has been limited, lockdown has provided us with ample opportunity for inward traveling so that we may access the infinite resources of our minds, hearts, and souls. What is grief? Grief is a normal human emotional experience. It is not an illness, but a necessary process of adjusting psychologically, socially, and spiritually to loss. Grief work therefore has to be done at both a psychological and spiritual level. Grieving cannot be solely an intellectual activity, nor is it permission to wallow or drown in our pain. Rather, it is a call to learn how to patiently and lovingly swim through a turbulent sea of pain to reach the shore. Acute grief is characterized by a wide range of emotional, bodily, mental, and spiritual symptoms and changes, and the experience differs from person to person. The emotional pangs of acute grief occur in varying durations of alternating waves of calmness and distress, ranging from a sense of numbing emptiness, nothingness, and despair, to bouts of anxiety, sadness, anger, hatred, and fear. Because our bodies and minds are intrinsically interconnected, grief does impact our physical health as well. The pain of grief may be accompanied by bodily aches and pains, as well as disturbances in sleep, energy, and appetite levels. Temporarily, pre-existing medical conditions such as diabetes and hypertension may worsen, or stress-induced medical disorders like stomach ulcers may develop. Unprocessed or unresolved grief represents blocked energy, which can have medical, psychological, and psychiatric complications, both in the acute phase and up to years and even decades later. Seek medical attention as indicated, but note that the pain of grief itself is not one that can be numbed or eradicated by medication. Similarly, even though clinical depression may complicate grief in some and may require antidepressant treatment, medication will not obviate the need for the emotional work to be done. Mentally, grief incites a struggle to make intellectual sense of such a painful loss. Through the limited lens of the human mind, death's seemingly random and untimely visitations may defy logic or meaning. For those that are religious or spiritual, death may also precipitate a crisis of faith. We question the benevolence, mercy, and love of the divine that seemingly cruelly and unfairly robbed us of a loved one. As social beings, grief elicits a communal social response that ensures shared pain and emotional and practical support. However, there may also be a need to temporarily disengage from social activities for a variable period. This shift focuses our energy away from outer worldly distractions to the important inner healing work that is required. The duration and severity or intensity of this acute stage of grief are governed by many factors related to the bereaved person, the deceased person, the quality of the relationship shared during life, and the nature and circumstances of the death. One cannot compare the nature or magnitude of the grief of one with that of another. Ultimately, the grief you experience is your own unique engagement with both your mortal human self and your immortal spiritual self. There are several stages of grieving, each of varying duration, that one may cycle back and forth from over time. Each stage has its corresponding emotional task. There are many factors that influence the degree of healing and resolution. While many can walk with you in this personal journey, nobody can walk this path for you. The death of a loved one inflicts an emotional wound that is as real as the wound inflicted on the body. Because the wound of grief is not outwardly visible or measurable, there is the danger of ignoring, denying, or neglecting it. Like any bodily wound, the wound that is grief must be lovingly nursed with physical, emotional, and spiritual support. Healing our inner wounds has become complicated in a society that is in general averse to acknowledging, accepting, and experiencing pain, both emotional or bodily. We would rather pop pills to the point of addiction, drink, smoke, shop, comfort eat, and binge watch television. Anything but give ourselves the loving permission, time, and space to feel and heal our pain. Pain is our body's inbuilt system. It's an alarm system. Just as the inability to feel physical pain, as enticing as that may seem, poses grave dangers that would threaten our very survival, so too, emotional pain serves an important alerting function. However, only when embraced and digested can its wisdom be assimilated and appreciated. Like any bodily wound, the care required in the acute stages of grief are different to that required in the later stages. The type of medicine you need is guided by where in your journey with grief you are. Your life does not end with the death of a loved one. As an acute bodily wound heals, there is progression to the next stage of recovery, the restoration of function. Similarly, as the acute pain of grief eases, there should be gradual resumption of personal, social, and occupational responsibilities. Functional engagement is therapeutic and not intended to make you forget, but rather to start integrating your loss into your life. There will be varying frequencies and intensities of remembrance, which can be both painful and comforting. Embrace them both. They facilitate healing. However, the past is a place you may visit only, not a place to reside in. There should be no room for guilt in grief. No person, living or dead, and no human relationship is perfect. Accept that grief may be accompanied by bittersweet memories as well. And remember that death does not automatically confer sainthood on the departed. For the bereaved, grief describes a transitional, albeit painful state, not a final resting place. This transition can be facilitated by a few simple measures. Firstly, give yourself loving care and permission to receive emotional and social support from family, friends, and community, and as necessary, from spiritual counselors and mental health professionals. Secondly, every cultural group has developed ritualistic practices that help us connect the material and spiritual realms. Rituals are a means to link the outer with the inner, the human with the spiritual, the material with the mystical. Every significant milestone in the human life of a Hindu is commemorated by the performance of rituals that sanctify and spiritualize these major life transitions. Funeral and bereavement rites and rituals serve an important therapeutic purpose. They are designed in their nature and timings to ease both the transition of the departed soul to the spiritual abode and the adjustment of the bereaved humans to their loss. Due to lockdown, much distress has been felt by those unable to perform many of these rituals. A page from our scriptures is worth referencing in this regard. Lord Rama performed his father King Dasharatha's last rites while living as an ascetic, in exile, and in the forest. The merit of a ritual lies in the bhav and bhakti with which it is performed, as exemplified by the humble offerings of Shabari and Sudama to Lords Rama and Krishna respectively. The creation of meaningful, personalized, non-religious rituals in the context of grief therapy is well recognized and shown to be effective in providing both meaning and healing. So lockdown should be no impediment to honoring sacred rituals, as the heart is not in lockdown. One of the many useful lessons of the pandemic has been its power to awaken us to both the need for and possibility of being able to survive by focusing on the essence and essentials of life. Adopt a pragmatic approach. If circumstances preclude the performance of rituals, there are other equally effective ways to bring solace to the deceased and the living. Thirdly, prayer is a universal, all-powerful healing balm for those on earth and beyond. Swami Shivananda writes that prayer acts on the principle of a radio station and broadcasts the waves of good thoughts, just as the radio station broadcasts waves of sound. Prayers, kirtan, and good thoughts from relatives and friends can give real solace to the departed souls. Here again, we are lovingly reminded that there are no lockdown restrictions on praying. Prayer happens in the heart, not in the temple or ashram. Finally, cultivate spiritual values such as faith, spiritual acceptance, surrender, forgiveness, humility, gratitude, compassion, and universal love. The sattvic food consumed during bereavement also promote an inner state of serenity and peace, and developing these spiritual attributes will facilitate healing. Bereaved individuals experience much distress worrying that the departed soul is in a state of isolation and pain. This has given rise to the growing popularity of seeking crossing over communications with departed souls. After death, the departed soul can still access your thoughts and emotions, even though the reverse is not true. It should be a source of comfort to those bereaved that information from our scriptures, thousands of case reports and studies of past life regression therapy and near-death experiences consistently attest to the following. The cessation of human life is a painless and peaceful transition to the spiritual realm. The departing soul is comforted and accompanied in its journey. The other side is so sublimely beautiful that departing souls are reluctant to return to their mortal frames. The departed are pain-free and at peace in their new abode. You will agree that it would be highly inappropriate for parents to barge into their child's classroom at school just because they were missing or pining for the child. Similarly, distraught, intense clinging, and distress calls to the departed soul impedes its onward journey. Just as the departed soul has to continue its learning in higher realms, your learning continues on this earthly plane until your soul mission is completed. And if the late Aji or Aya wants to get in touch with you about where she hid the gold necklace, rest assured that the spiritual internet is far more powerful than our social media platforms. She will let you know where the necklace is hidden in divine time. Transcending suffering. The mortality rate for man is 100%. Every one of us is going to die one day. This is a harsh and painful truth. Although grief is a universal human experience, the loss of a loved one defies explanation and meaning from a human perspective. However, our human experience is our spiritual learning ground, and the contemplation of two simple yet useful questions will guide us from and through our daily painful human experiences to spiritual illumination and transcendence. Who or what am I, and why am I here on this planet? The first question pertains to our identity. Who or what am I? Sri Paramahansa Yogananda stated that if man wants to avoid permanently all forms of misery, he must learn soul identification. Upon taking birth as a human, a veil of amnesia or forgetting overcomes the soul, and life as a human is lived with varying degrees of awareness of our true spiritual identity. As humans, we grieve, yet the departing soul merely exits the physical, perishable body and act no different from undressing or moving to another room in a building. The second question pertains to meaning. Why am I here on this planet? Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage. We are merely players who have our exits and our entrances." Our scriptures describe the purpose of a human life as representing a learning and evolutionary experience for the soul in its quest for enlightenment and ultimate merging with the Supreme. In essence, planet Earth is the school or campus for the soul. And like enrollments into any learning institution, life on this Earth campus has fixed start and end of term dates, together with clear learning objectives. As spiritual beings, in a higher state of knowing, souls study the Akashic records between lives and then make an informed choice to take birth in specifically chosen circumstances and in the company of carefully chosen fellow souls in order to fulfill their chosen learning objectives for an allotted lifetime. In that state of higher knowing, the timing and nature of death are also agreed upon. As Swami Shivananda states, the span of life is predestined. For the bereaved, the experience of loss is a message from the universe to awaken us to our spiritual identity and our sacred soul contracts. By meditating on and realizing our higher purpose on this planet, our grief may not necessarily grow smaller, but we will grow bigger. And in this empowered state, our grief takes on meaning and becomes bearable. The death of a loved one precipitates a crisis in a human relationship. From the earthly perspective, relationships are primary sources of love, companionship, and emotional security. From a spiritual perspective, however, every person in your life is there by your soul choice and divine design to serve your spiritual growth needs. Relationships never end, they only change. Every person is physically present in your life only for as long as needed to master a soul lesson. Like our stay on the planet, every human relationship is a fixed-term contract, and some contracts, sadly, end at death. Once you pass matric, you may no longer remain in high school, no matter how comfortable or attached you are to the place and the people. So too, in the name of spiritual growth, progress, and divine order, the soul must return to the spiritual realm to contemplate and continue its further learning. Every living and grieving moment requires us to make choices that either move us towards healing or keep us stuck in our pain. Death is a reminder to each of us to live each day fully, dharmically, with love, purpose, meaning, and gratitude, and within a larger cosmic framework. The pain of loss is inevitable. Suffering, however, is optional. Just as the grain of sand retained rather than ejected from the bosom of the oyster transforms into a pearl, so too the pain of grief can be transformed into pearls of wisdom. None of us can escape the pain of loss, but it is our resistance to it that creates suffering. By surrendering to the natural ebb and flow of life, you live in harmony with cosmic spiritual laws, and you can heal. Pain without meaning is suffering. Finding meaning in suffering. After experiencing a loss, we will recognize the end of our suffering when we are no longer captured by death and grief. Our earthly relationships are strengthened. We have a new and renewed purpose in life and living. The lessons from our personal loss are translated into beneficial actions for others. We discover and develop inner strengths to become a better human. Our spirituality is awakened and deepened, and our hearts expand in love to include those beyond our immediate family and friends. This is the higher road that will give us a glimpse of our divinity and a taste of eternity. We will know then that we have transcended human suffering and experienced grace. In summary, death teaches us life lessons. Navigate your journey through the pain of grief by feeling and healing your human pain and accepting it as spiritual medicine, bitter in the short term, but beneficial in the long run. Get support from people in prayer, but also draw on your own inner resources. And once your pain is sufficiently relieved, continue the human journey inward, onward, and upward. A mother bird helps her fledgling to find its wings so that it may leave the nest. That is an act of love and a fulfillment of a duty. A parent takes loving pride in progressing his beloved child from primary to high school, from high school to university. All are acts of selfless and loving investment in the growth and progress of the loved one. So too, lovingly releasing our departed loved ones to continue their journey of learning in the higher school is the natural divine order that we need to aspire to and honor. This is no ordinary or easy task to accomplish. But then again, grief is a small price to pay for those we loved and cherished so dearly. Human life is an aspirational and educational spiritual journey. As we journey through our personal and collective grief, may we all be granted the graces of courage, endurance, faith, enlightenment, love, compassion, and moksha.
Our final speaker this afternoon is Mr. Suntosh Pillay. Suntosh Pillay is a clinical psychologist at the King Dinizulu Hospital Complex in Sydenham, Durban, and is affiliated to the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Department of Clinical Medicine. He also serves on the National Council of the Psychological Society of South Africa. He is passionate about setting up community-based support groups to improve access to mental health care. He co-founded the KZN Mental Health Advocacy Group and the Provincial Office of the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADAG. Academically, he has presented his research in numerous conferences and has published his articles in international journals and textbooks. He is currently on the editorial board for journal Psychology in Society and writes actively in the areas of social justice, race, sexuality, and mental health.
Hi there, I'm Suntosh Pillay. Nice to meet all of you. I'm a clinical psychologist at King Dinizulu Hospital Complex. It would have been great if we could meet everybody in person, but because of social distancing, we've got to do things electronically and through this webinar. I've got a very short space of time to talk about a very large topic. And so I obviously can't do it justice in these 15 minutes. So I'm just going to touch on a few pertinent issues that are coming up specifically during COVID-19, because grief and bereavement are obviously topics that are very large just on their own. And I'm sure most of you already have a good working knowledge of how to understand grief and bereavement and how to help people who are going through this incredibly difficult time. So one of the factors that I want to focus on today for the purposes of this webinar is how natural protective mechanisms are now insufficient to help people going through the grieving process. And one of those natural mechanisms is people's cultural frameworks and their cultural backgrounds. And what do I mean by this? I mean that when people experience death in their families, one of the things that kicks in automatically is culture. All of us belong to some sort of culture. It doesn't mean that we have to be particularly religious or spiritual, but it means that we are all embedded in some sort of cultural framework that tends to know what to do when someone passes away. For example, if you part of the Islamic faith, you know that things have to get done very quickly because a funeral has to happen within 24 hours. If you're a Hindu, you know that your grieving process goes up to a year. And in fact, for the first 13 or 16 days, it's intense family time, rituals, singing of prayer songs, family gatherings. And the mourning period goes on for 3 months, 6 months, and eventually 1 year. If you're Christian, you know that there's often a church service. If you are Jewish, there's something called the sitting Shiva. If you're Buddhist, there are other particular types of rituals that take place. If you, from an African traditional background, you know that funerals are often big events and sometimes even celebrations. You know that people don't even need an invitation to attend. They tend to happen on weekends. Part of it is even celebratory. And so depending on the culture that you come from, your culture knows exactly what to do and it knows how to do it. During COVID-19, unfortunately, those things cannot take place in the way that they used to, which means that the natural protection we have from developing serious psychopathology due to grief and loss suddenly cannot take place anymore. And every culture, like I said, has their own customs and their own rituals for dealing with how we mourn our loved ones. But every culture shares one common element, and that common element is social connection. No matter what culture you're from, no matter what belief system you have, no matter what religion you follow, no matter what your spiritual inclination, social connection is at the heart of helping people grieve during the loss of a loved one. And unfortunately, because of physical distancing during COVID-19, that social connection is now very difficult because part of social connection is physical comfort. One of the times as human beings that we need to feel another person's body on us, we need to have that skin-to-skin contact, is during the grieving process. We naturally hold someone's hand. We naturally wipe someone's tears. We naturally hug someone and hold them tight. And that physical connection is so important for us as human beings to process emotions during a grieving process. And so the grieving process is now disrupted. We've got to do it in a way that's actually unnatural to us as human beings, but also unnatural to the kinds of cultures that we come from. So it can feel especially isolating and difficult at a time when you need that the most. People feel sadness during a grieving process, but now they're also going to feel helpless, they're going to feel anger, and they're going to feel frustration. One of the reasons anger and frustration are going to be common feelings is because beside dealing with the loss of the loved one, they're also dealing with the loss of familiar cultural processes. Because one of the things that makes grief bearable is that when your culture kicks in automatically, there's a certain soothing comfort that takes place knowing that certain things are taken care of. For example, in many cultures, the grieving family doesn't have to worry about cooking. Other people might even move in with them for a short period of time and take care of daily chores and cook food and ensure that they're taken care of. But this is probably impossible now during COVID-19. During a funeral is one time that you tend to see relatives and friends and people that you haven't seen in a very long time, because it's expected that no matter what your differences, no matter how long you haven't seen people, funerals are times when people come together, they put their differences aside. It decreases the distance between loved ones who haven't seen each other in a long time. Old feuds are forgotten. But now, because funerals are limited to 50 people or less, and many people are opting to have even smaller funerals only with absolutely immediate family, many people are not getting that opportunity. Many people are losing out on the chance to have those social relationships mended because grief is a time that brings people together. And so there's anger, there's frustration, and there's helplessness. And so one of the possibilities is that people have to surrender their sacred cultural practices to the pandemic. So you're making a sacrifice. You are losing your loved ones, but you're also sacrificing the rituals that you would have normally used to provide you comfort. So in fact, what's happening now during COVID-19 is that there is a double loss. There's the loss of the person who died, and also the loss of your culture, the loss of your familiar rituals and processes, which means we have to help people process these complex emotions which they ordinarily might not have felt with this intensity before that. One of the consequences of this is that we might see far more psychopathology when it comes to grief and bereavement. And although we know that grief can eventually lead to depression if people cannot tolerate the loss of the loved one, in general, human beings mourn and then are able to integrate that loss into their life and carry on living a healthy, functional life. But we do know that some grief can become complex. And when that happens, we tend to call that either complicated bereavement, or to use the language of the DSM or the ICD, prolonged grief disorder or persistent complex bereavement disorder. And those of you who haven't heard those terms before, prolonged grief disorder is basically grief that endures beyond the normal functioning and interferes with the person's life and lasts for at least 6 to 12 months. The DSM says 12 months, but the new ICD-11 criteria says 6 months. And it creates a sense of disbelief where you can't accept that the person has died, and you're unable to accept the loss, even though a significant period of time has passed, and even though it's not culturally appropriate anymore to be mourning. And this inability to continue with your healthy life can often lead to you feeling continuously intense feelings, or even on the extreme end, feeling quite emotionally numb. And research shows that this increases the risk of substance abuse, sleep disorders, and even impairs your immune functioning, which we know is not a good thing during a global pandemic, because a lowered immunity means that you are at higher risk of contracting the virus. And at its most extreme end, this might eventually lead to depression and even suicidal thinking, especially if people have been very dependent on the person for whom they've lost. Research shows that this prolonged grief disorder before COVID-19 happened in about 1 in 10 people. But with COVID-19, chances are that this might increase even more. There's a lot of research on this area, so I do suggest that if you suspect people are suffering from this prolonged grief disorder, or that their bereavement is reaching a stage where it's actually culturally inappropriate and is interfering with their occupation and social functioning, that you do some background research to discover how you can help people. And I also said that I want to talk a little bit about culture, because although I've been talking about culture in quite general terms, I think it's important to understand that as South Africans especially, we are a very religious and a very cultural society. That based on our last Stats SA General Household Survey, it showed that the majority of South Africans belong to some sort of religion, either Christian, Muslim, African traditional religions, Hindu, Jewish, Buddhist, or other kind of more marginal minority religions. And so depending which religious belief you have, there is a particular way in which your background deals with grief and bereavement. And I'm sure no matter what background you come from, those social connections are going to be disrupted during this time. So the reason I'm emphasizing this is because this speaks to how we intervene then in mental health interventions. It means that we've got to find ways to help people connect socially, because that'll be the way in which we help them deal with the loss. And this is going to be quite difficult, because as a psychologist, and especially as someone that is a big fan of support groups, that would be my go-to solution at a time like this. People who are struggling with grief, my suggestion would be that you enroll them into a support group specifically for grief. But we know that even our regular mental health interventions are now almost impossible to take place because of physical distancing and because of safety measures to prevent the spread of the novel coronavirus, which means even something like a support group, which would be a fantastic mental health intervention, cannot happen now in the ways that it used to happen before. Or if it does happen, the venues have to allow for significant social distancing. Everybody will have to wear a mask on. People will have to sanitize before and after they enter. And the numbers of people that are in that support group will have to be limited. But if you can run a support group, that would be probably one of the most ideal interventions, for people who are suffering from grief and bereavement at this time. If you cannot run a physical support group, then one of the options might be to do this electronically, maybe in a similar way in which we're having this training right now. But one of the difficulties with electronic interventions is that not everybody has equal access to the internet, to computers, to smartphones, to reliable Wi-Fi. And we know that data can be quite costly. And so running an online support group, although it might be one solution to physical distancing, does not suit everybody, especially people who might be struggling in outlying areas, who even before COVID-19 did not have equal access to mental health care services. So we're going to have to think of very creative ways in which we intervene with people. But the principle behind our interventions will have to be around social connection. We've got to find ways to get people to connect with each other. We've got to find ways for people to get the kind of social support that they would have received had their culture not been disrupted because of physical distancing. And we've got to create a space where people can express their feelings in a way that's respectful and where they're not being judged and where it's confidential. And so as a counselor or as a therapist or as a psychologist, or even as a health professional trying to do some mental health intervention, some of the therapeutic considerations that you've got to have is, number one, remembering that you are dealing with a double mourning, a double loss, the loss of the loved one and the loss of familiar cultural comforts, familiar cultural context. Secondly, that you are going to help the person reconstruct the grieving process, because whatever grieving process they went through, it was missing the cultural elements that would have normally helped them make sense of this experience. But because they didn't have that, they might then be feeling a sense that there isn't proper closure because they didn't do things that they've been raised to believe are the correct things to do when someone passes away, which can be quite difficult. So there might be this kind of existential or spiritual angst, a feeling of incompleteness, a feeling that something is missing, maybe even guilt that they're going to do something wrong, maybe even guilt that if they're Hindu, bad karma might come to them. If you believe in ancestors, that the ancestors might be angry. That if you believe in heaven or hell, that you might have even done something that doesn't allow the good departure of that soul. Whatever it is, whatever beliefs people have, it's important that you work with those beliefs. And during these kinds of mental health interventions, we allow open discussion of topics like religion, of spirituality, of cultural beliefs. If we don't allow these conversations, there's going to be resistance to therapy. There's going to be resistance that the counseling space or the mental health space is not actually catering for the problems and the concerns that I actually have. And if we allow these conversations to happen, we will then also prevent the medicalization of grief. And by the medicalization of grief, I mean that we don't instantly think that the way people are responding is pathological. Because even though I spoke about the possible increase in prolonged grief disorder, our first step shouldn't be to assume that the person has a disorder. Our first step should be to assume that the person's natural ways of healing, their natural ways of boosting resilience has been disrupted. And so we need to, in some way, we have to be a substitute for the culture that would have taken place instead of us. We are a poor substitute for culture, but unfortunately, we might be the only substitute that people have during this time. And so it's important to help them process feelings of guilt, of shame, of anger, of sadness, etc. There's many other things I can say about grief and about bereavement, but I think the important principles have been outlined. And I think it's important that you work from the point at which the person is, that you deal with their immediate concerns, that you are not quick to pathologize their experiences, that you actually help them contain a situation that might feel very uncontainable and might be very difficult for them to make sense of, because all of us are figuring this out as we're going along. It's difficult to know how to deal with situations we've never had to confront before. Many of us, for the first time, are having to scratch our heads and wonder, how do you have funerals with physical distancing? Many of us have no idea what to do when we see the bereaved family, whether we are allowed to hug them or shake their hands or just look at them. What do we do in their physical presence? These are all questions that are new to all of us. We're all figuring it out as we go along. And you're one of the people that would be invited to be part of the journey of people who are struggling with these issues. So I wish you well. Unfortunately, this could not be a live session because I pre-recorded this. And if you've got any questions or if you'd like to engage further on this, I am available. You can give me a call on 031-242-6180. Or you can find me on the KZN Health email system. My name is Suntosh Pillay. So my email address will be santosh.pillay@kznhealth.gov.za. I'm happy to help anybody, assist anybody, or speak through any kind of questions you might have about mental health and COVID-19, or in particular, how to help people who are going through issues of grief and bereavement. All the best, and thank you for all the great work that you are doing during this time, because you're one of the people who's kind of at the front line of this pandemic as well. Stay safe and take care of yourself.
To conclude this afternoon's webinar, we must remember that life by nature is very short, but the memory of a life well spent is eternal. Grief is often noted as the final act of love that we must give to those that we have loved. And remember that where there is deep grief, there was once great love. And as a quote by Vicky Harrison goes, grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water may be calm, and sometimes it is overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. The South African Hindu Maha Sabha would like to place on record its deep gratitude and appreciation to our excellent professional panelists, Dr. Lokesh Maharaj, Professor Suvira Ramlall, and Mr. Suntosh Pillay, who went above and beyond the call of duty to prepare their presentations. We'd like to thank Hindavani, Lotus FM, The Post, and The Rising Sun for their excellent media coverage, the Designer Works team for their outstanding technical support, and lastly, thank you to you, our viewers, for attending today's webinar. Have a pleasant evening. Namaste. Vanakkam.